The Red Hive. I used to make videos. Not to a large following. Just little interesting clips about life in a small town and the various people who live there. It wasn't just content for the sake of content. It was a record to show what life was like in the 2020s for the folks of Tomskog, Minnesota. I'd done a couple of videos already. One was about the old couple running the corner pub. One was about a landlord, and another was about the principal of the local high school and their apparent pool troubles. Long story. I was doing a shorter video about a woman named Marla. She was a beekeeper who worked with moving intrusive hives. This kind of content gets a lot of views, so I figured I'd do a more compact but better edited video this time around. I'd done my research, prepped my gear, and was rearing to go. I met Marla on a Thursday morning in late May. We took her pickup, had a gas station sandwich for breakfast, and stopped for a quick coffee. I talked to her a bit about her job, her life, and her aspirations. Small town stuff. She was the kind of woman who was happy as long as she could keep up with her payments and have a bit left over for a Netflix subscription. Wholesome. She drove me out to the site of the day, talking to the camera as we went. We were turning further and further off the paved roads, as the suspension struggled against weeds, rock, and gravel. "There's a hive near a walking trail," Marla explained. "A small couple of folks called in about their dogs getting scared. It should be fine, but we're gonna gear up just in case they're mistaken." "You expect us to get stung a lot?" I asked. "Not really," she smiled. "Not if you know what you're doing. But there have been times when folks have been called in about a hive, and it turned out to be paper wasps. Not as pleasant as honeybees." "No," she laughed. "No, they really aren't." We passed through a section of trees that covered both sides of the road, the branches hanging low enough to scrape the hood of the car. Emerging on the other side, a field opened up to our right. A large, wide-open field, covered from end to end in blue sunflowers. A local variety, that is, apparently, sort of rare. I asked Marla about them. "The blues? Yeah, they were introduced as a sort of gimmick back in the 1930s, I think? 1940s, maybe. They're actually quite invasive. I'm surprised there aren't more of them around." "But bees can make honey on them?" "I guess," she nodded. "They're just sunflowers." "Have you tried it? Is it blue?" "Can't say that I have," she laughed, "but I'm sure it's fine. Ordinary sunflower honey is fantastic. Kinda earthy." We got out and suited up. It felt like putting on a tent. Marla shared some interesting bee factoids that I didn't manage to catch on camera, but I made a mental note to ask her to repeat it later. Of course, I wouldn't. I'm kind of forgetful. I hadn't seen a single bee yet, but Marla was already heading out into the field. The sunflowers reached about waist high, and there was a strange, almost chemical smell in the air. Sort of a mix of chlorine and ammonia. As we got further out, Marla pointed out a couple of flowers to me. "Right there," she said. "Get a clip." I zoomed in, spotting two bees chilling on a blue sunflower petal. They were just sort of sitting there. They had a slightly more reddish tint to them than I expected. Marla didn't seem to mind, nor notice. It didn't take long before we got to the hive. I immediately started filming as we approached. The buzzing got louder as bees started to poke and prod at my defenses, curiously checking for gaps in my gloves and neck. Thankfully, Marla had helped me secure it. Still, the buzzing kinda gave me the creeps. Never been a fan of bugs. "Yeah, all right," Marla laughed. "No wonder there are bees. Someone set this up." It was a man-made hive, framed with sheets of mahogany, a series of wooden squares with hollow cork pipes lining the inside. The bees had already taken to it, transforming it into a sturdy hive. "We usually call these bee hotels," Marla said. "Some kind-hearted local set it up. But as this isn't private property, we have to take complaints into account. I'm gonna make sure we move to a better location with more nutrition for our freebie friends here, where they won't spook any dog walkers. And of course, we're keeping the hive. Someone put a lot of thought into this. I got a nice video out of it. How she unsecured the hive, moved the sections one by one, and pointed to interesting pieces for the camera. She found the queen and scooped her up in a separate container. Marla stopped for a moment, though. Apparently, the queen was larger than she'd anticipated. I didn't really have a frame of reference, so I had to take her word for it. We wrapped the hive up under a tarp on the pickup and made our way back to Marla's property. I was afraid all the bumps in the road would shake the bees loose, but they seemed perfectly content. I guess it helped that Marla was a very calm driver, despite some curious bees making their way inside the cabin. We still had the suits on, luckily. There was a cute hand-painted sign of a bee as we entered Marla's land. When you live in the middle of nowhere, most folks can get away with owning more land than they need, especially if you don't mind having spotty internet, or a fair drive to the nearest supermarket. One look at Marla showed that she didn't mind either of these things. We took some time offloading the hive, finding a good spot on the eastern side of her property. There were plenty of wildflowers for the critters to feast on, and Marla seemed confident in her choice. There wasn't much more to it. We set it up, captured a couple of finishing thoughts, and called it a day. As I packed up my gear and took off my suit, I got a moment to speak with Marla without the camera. She was excited to have a new hive, but there was something about her expression that seemed a bit off. "I'd love to try some of their honey," I said. "I think it'd make a great end to the video." "Yeah, I'll keep in touch," she nodded. There was an oppressive silence as she stared into the distance. I tilted my head, trying to catch her attention. "You all right there?" I asked. "Yeah," she nodded. I'm just anxious. New responsibilities, you know?" "Is there a problem?" She bit down on her lip, squinting. "Maybe." A couple of days later, I started getting updates. Marla was having some trouble with the hive. It was more aggressive than she'd previously thought, and a lot of the bees had been dying off at alarming rates. "It happens when you move them sometimes," she sighed. "It's rare, but it happens. They can have trouble adapting." She managed to get a little honey, but she wasn't too happy about it. Apparently, it wasn't as sweet and sugary as she thought it'd be. There was just something off about it, texture-wise. She was going to make me a little bottle of it either way, for the video, but she advised against eating it. Returning to my day job, I was looking forward to hearing more from Marla. Out of all the people I'd worked with, she'd been the most eager to contribute to my channel. We kept in touch over the week, discussing further collaborations and other ways we could make content. She suggested making a couple of DIY videos to showcase some neat tricks for would-be hobby apiarists. The following weekend, we met up again. Another early morning, this time with a light drizzle splattering against the hood of her pickup. The moment she came around, I could tell something had happened. She had these bright red spots on her arms, and she was a lot less talkative than usual. Before I got the chance to talk to her about it, she explained. "Got swarmed yesterday," she said. "Never happened before." "Those are all stings?" "That's just the thing," she scoffed. "It isn't. They're bites. I didn't think honeybees bit people. They don't." We just looked at one another for a moment. Her marks were pretty nasty, some of them swollen enough to burst. The conclusion was obvious. These weren't ordinary honeybees. We made our way back to the field where we'd found them. I did a little filming, but Marla was self-conscious about her arms. She was scared that it might dissuade people from working with bees, and she kept repeating how it was her fault for not handling them correctly. She said it so many times I couldn't help but to feel she was trying to convince herself rather than me, or an audience. We made our way out into the field. Marla flipped open a pocket knife and bent down to check on the flowers. Cutting one off at the stem, she examined it for a moment. She held it up for me to see for myself. I looked it over but couldn't see anything strange, apart from the obvious blue color. "You gotta touch it," she said. "Check it." So I did. As soon as I touched it, a few petals came loose. The flower was clearly dead and dry. Checking out a couple more, we came to a startling realization. The entire field was in fact completely dead. Bone dry of pollen and sustenance, and according to Marla, it must have been dead for months. I didn't really understand why that was such a big deal. Because, Marla explained, the hive flourished out here, in the middle of the field. If they couldn't survive here, they would have migrated, but they didn't. So, what the hell have they been eating? Whatever it was, it's what must have made the honey taste weird. Not just taste, Marla said, shaking her head. The smell is the worst. Like stale bacteria and methane. Things started to fall into place. Whatever they had been eating out here in the field wasn't available at Marla's place. Hence why they had been dying and getting more aggressive. Getting back to the pickup, Marla was deep in her own thoughts, drumming her fingers on the dashboard. She couldn't figure it out. I tried to cheer her up with a pat on her shoulder, which caused her to flinch a little. I probably poked a bite mark. "Sorry," I said. "But, maybe that's why they swarmed you." "What do you mean?" "Well, maybe they tried to eat you up." I chuckled, pointing to her arms. "Bees don't do that," said Marla, her face stern. I know," I nodded. "Sorry. Bad joke." But I could tell I'd planted something in Marla's thoughts, something that worried her. As we went back to her property, she explained that there was indeed a kind of bee that was carnivorous. There was a type of bee called the vulture bee that fed exclusively on meat. Mostly carrion, though. They weren't active hunters. They couldn't be, as they were stingless. "You think these might be vulture bees, then?" I asked. "They live south of the border," she explained. "Can't imagine them just, popping up. And even so, they wouldn't be this aggressive. Would explain the honey, though." Marla's face went pale. Had she been eating meat honey? I decided to hold off on posting my video. This was turning into something more interesting, and I wanted to see it through. I filmed a couple of shots where Marla got to explain the intricacies of vulture bees. She did it in the frame of an interesting fact rather than a suspicion, but I could tell something had changed. She wasn't as certain anymore, and a bit of eagerness had run out of her. There was a tangible worry there. As we went out back to check out the hive, Marla stopped. Her eyes widened. "Turn off the camera," she hissed. 3 dead pigeons, covered in bees. From that point on, I was fully invested. This was something neither of us had seen before, unfamiliar ground. It didn't take long for Marla to confirm that the honey she'd harvested did, indeed, contain a meat protein. After that, it was just a matter of observation. Yes, the bees ate flesh. They bit instead of stung. But they weren't vulture bees. These were larger, more aggressive, and had a wider abdomen. Their mandibles were longer, and they had a slightly reddish tint to them. It was difficult to tell whether the color was a result of mutation or blood. The dead pigeons were stripped to the sinew in surprisingly little time. Marla didn't know what to do. She'd been working with preserving bees since she was a teenager, and this whole situation was testing her. She didn't want to just kill the hive, but she couldn't let them spread either. These could be highly invasive. But she took too long to decide. Just a couple of days later, 2 of the other hives on her property had been completely decimated. The red bees had killed and devoured all of them, leaving only empty chambers and hollow carapaces behind. When Marla FaceTimed me about it, she couldn't hold back the tears. By now, I considered myself a friend of hers. We talked a lot and got along really well, and it wasn't just about content anymore. I didn't want to see her like that. She deserved better. I offered to drop by and brainstorm a bit. I figured she needed the company. She'd done at least 24 of these bee rescues, and the one time someone came to cheer her on, it all went to hell. That had to suck. So I dropped by one day after work. The sun was setting, dark clouds on the horizon. I noticed them the moment I stepped out of my car. A handful of red bees climbed to the white picket fence outside Marla's house. A few others were clustered in a particular spot near the edge of the house, no doubt feasting on a small bird or a rodent. I went up to the door and rung the bell, ducking from a couple of curious bees trying to make themselves comfortable in my rough post-work hairdo. Marla invited me into her kitchen, offering me homemade lemonade. She had these custom-made coasters with cartoon bees on them, along with a logo for her rescue. I could tell she'd taken a couple of sudden precautions. There were tape lining the edges of the windows, as well as a plastic sheet covering the ventilation duct. No wonder the air felt stale. "No one knows what to do," she sighed. "I called the Wyatt brothers, southbound AP... They can't even believe it. They actually don't believe that I have what I say I have." "And what is that? What is it you have?" She sighed, scratching her eyebrows, a kind of nervous tick. "There's no name, but... I know what they do. I know now. They're like the vulture bees, but..." She threw her arms up in surrender. I could tell she was tired. One of her eyes drooped a little lower than the other. Might have been from a bite, too. Marla spent the better part of an hour showing me websites, witnesses to similar bees, drawings, and descriptions. She talked about the application of pesticides, mutations, climate change, GMOs, and microplastics. Hell, at one point, she was bringing up 5G towers as a possible culprit. She was all over the place, and I could tell her heart wasn't in it. It was all just desperation, grasping at straws. After a couple of hours, well into the dark of the evening, we'd gone from homemade lemonade to lukewarm, well-nursed beers. We'd run out of ideas and topics. Instead, we just stood by the kitchen window, watching the red bees crawl across the glass. Marla put down her bottle, this time without using one of her cartoon bee coasters. "Check this out," she said. She placed her hand on the window, and the bees outside immediately swarmed to it. Within seconds, there was a cluster of at least 40 crowding around her hand, on the other side of the glass. "Give them a minute," she continued. "It's kind of crazy." They started to move in a pattern, a sort of pulse, moving counterclockwise from a perfect circle into a four-armed spiral. Their wings pattered in unison, a buzzing noise that scratched against the window pane. "I can't explain that," she said. "I can explain following my hand or killing other hives, but that?" She shook her head, not looking away. "I can't explain that." It got a little bit too late, and I'd had a couple of beers too many, so I decided to crash on her couch. I wrapped myself in a blanket and pulled a pillow up to my ear, so I wouldn't have to hear the buzzing outside. It wasn't loud, but it was such a distinct sound that I couldn't unhear it. Marla didn't seem to share the same issue, though. She just walked into her room, and that was that. Out like a light. I had an uneasy sleep, falling in and out of surface-level dreams. I remember forcing my eyes open, just to see if I could. I was uncomfortable, and I couldn't stop hearing that buzzing noise. Even when things were quiet, I kept imagining myself hearing it. I'd see little black spots on the windows as they landed and disappeared, looking for a way in. Somewhere in the early morning hours, I was finally out cold. I didn't notice those first few sounds, how the tapping against the window got louder, how the patterns got bigger and clearer. I was finally asleep, and it was already too late when I woke up. I was lying on my side as I popped open a single eye, only to see a red bee on my hand calmly brushing itself clean. I didn't notice the droning noise at first, until I realized the background noise of the room was different. Looking beyond that first red bee towards the window, I realized something. The pattern of bees was on the inside of the window. There were hundreds of bees already inside the room, but the sound was closer than that. It was all around me, and somewhere in the background, I could hear a breeze. Was the front door open? I tried to stay completely still, but I could feel something in my chest tightening. I wanted to brush the bee off, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Something was holding me back, keeping me from just waving my arms around and getting out. There was something more to this. Seconds later, there was a noise. A rising murmur, like a moving mass. Best way I can describe it is a vibrating burlap bag, followed by meaty footsteps. Not loud, but not quiet either. Someone didn't care too much about waking me. If there was ever a time to get up, to run, or to fight, that was it. But all I did was just lie there, staring at that one red bee on my hand, listening to something slowly approach from behind. It's as if I knew how badly outmatched I really was. I could feel something shift as the side of the couch was grabbed, creaking noises as fingers dug into old leather. Snapping sounds, sinew and muscles stretching and realigning under a thin layer of skin. Forced breathing and hissing descending on me from above. Little sniffs, then silence. I held my breath. You took my hive. Less of a voice and more of a collision of wings and carapaces. The red bee on my hand looked straight into my eyes. Not a single twitch. Nothing. I didn't. I whispered under my breath, trying not to move my mouth. I didn't. There was a pause, a sudden shift as someone stepped back. A little moving mass came loose, dropping on top of my blanket. A handful of red bees, carefully spreading out to investigate me. Behind me, footsteps, leading into Marla's bedroom. I could hear her deep breaths from here. I stayed completely still. I was unharmed. I'd be fine. I just had to wait. Every nerve in my body felt like it was put through a white fire, still, controlled, and desperate to explode into action. As the little creatures made their way across me, carefully looking me over, the pores on my skin were screaming at me to move, itch, and shudder. I could feel the hairs on my neck rise, only to be tugged on by eager mandibles. Then, a scream. Marla screamed, a bloody, mind-piercing screech, the kind of scream that you just know means pain. Hearing it was like feeling a physical push, and I couldn't hold myself from acting any longer. I rolled off the couch, trying to shake the bees off. The cluster on the window exploded into a disorganized attack, swarming every piece of me, and the room, and the adjoining kitchen. They were inside my clothes, in my hair, in my eyebrows, and they were going to eat their fair share. Every bite was white-hot fire, followed by a sudden stinging cold. I ran outside. I remember taking off my clothes, waving my shirt around. Shoeless and burned by bites, I ran from her house, making as much space between me and the hive as possible. There was this blur of buzzing, biting, flailing, and screaming, some of it mine, some of it Marla's, in the distance. Little red spots crawling across my waving shirt. I threw myself on the ground, rolling in the grass. I smacked my body with the palm of my hand over and over, ensuring me that the little tickle I felt wasn't another one of them. Then I just lay there, panting in the grass. They were gone. A single red bee on the palm of my hand remained, carefully brushing itself before casually flying off. I could feel the soothing morning dew on my cheek. I slowly sat up, leaning against a tree. I could see Marla's house in the distance as I gasped for air. There was a heaviness in my lungs, like I couldn't completely fill them. A man stepped out. Or at least the shape of a man. It was hard to tell at that distance. It was as if he wasn't completely solid. His silhouette kept shifting even as he stood still. He stopped in the doorway, looked at me, and just sort of dissolved. I burst into action. My phone was still inside, but I had a backup in my car. I wrestled it out of the glove compartment, staining the driver's seat with spots of blood. My fingertips were bleeding, making it hard to call emergency services. My cheek and tongue were swollen, making it even harder to speak. I made my way back inside as I frantically explained what happened. Well, what would you even call it? An assault? Marla wasn't in her bedroom, but there was plenty of blood. There was a sound further in. Her shower was running. She'd made it to her bathroom and dropped into her tub. She turned on the water, hoping to keep them off. The end result was her ending up swollen and unconscious in the bathtub. Dead bees bobbing in the water around her. Some still twitching. It was horrifying. She was bitten, and it wasn't just from bees. There were miscolored marks from all kinds of stings, coloring her skin both a burning red, a pale white, and a faint green. Her neck was almost as thick as her head. But she was alive. Emergency services arrived. They managed to keep her alive, but she had to be put on a ventilator. They claimed she'd had a massive allergic reaction. They said something similar about me, completely ignoring the eyewitness account of a strange intruder. It didn't help that neither me or Marla could say the slightest comprehensive thing about their appearance or identity. It took some time, but I recovered. Marla, too. By the time she got back home, not a single hive was left. Every single one had been butchered and devoured. And the red bees, well, they were just gone, along with their handmade hive. Not too long ago, I talked to a friend of a friend who worked at the sheriff's office. I told him where we'd found that first hive. He asked me at least 3 times if I was sure that that was the specific spot. Of course I was. I even had a clip of it. Turns out, that place had been the discovery site of at least half a dozen unidentified bodies a couple of years ago. Which in turn made me wonder. A couple of wanderers in the area had spoken about finding dead animals on the trail, only for them to be gone the next morning. It wouldn't surprise me if that field was littered with bones. But with the way these things work, there was no telling what else might have gone missing along that trail. The conversation is what spurred me to write this all down. Marla and I will never publish that video, and for all intents and purposes, neither of us will bring it up. This never happened. This couldn't be real. We can't move on with our lives if we keep talking about it, because there is nothing we can say that will make it all right. Instead, she has new hives. She has a new smile. And for a while, I think we can lie to ourselves just enough to make it.